April 1945, Kakazu Ridge, Okinawa. The perimeter is a sketch in charcoal wire, coral and breath. A patrol slides in low, timing their crawl to the wind. For years the night has been their accomplice, sound swallowed, shapes erased. Then a quiet click, a cable hum, and a carbine lifts with a lantern that doesn't shine. The brush blooms in ghost green. One figure, then three, then a file of shadows resolving as if the jungle itself betrayed them. A whisper back to the gun team, a measured burst cleaves the dark. The rest scatter into angles already mapped. By dawn, the rumor has outrun the sun Americans are seeing without light. The Axis' most reliable weapon, the night, has failed without warning, as if someone rewired the Earth. No star shell, no flare gun, no moon. Just an invisible beam and a glass tube that turns stealth into silhouette. Men compare notes like superstitious farmers after a storm. The ground is the same, the wire is the same, only the rules have shifted. The shock is not that people died in the dark. The shock is that the dark changed sides. Before this ridge, confidence was doctrine. The Axis had learned to live inside darkness, breathing with it, fighting through it, using it to erase distance and parity. In Europe, raiding parties rehearsed the grammar of night wire cutters, wrapped in cloth, felt-soled boots, grenades cradled like eggs, a map drawn in memory rather than ink. In the Pacific, infiltration was an art crawl, freeze, listen, then rise from dead ground where American arcs of fire could not meet. Night was a multiplier, a free regiment of shadows that arrived precisely when reconnaissance failed and discipline thinned. Technology reinforced the belief. Optics were king by day. By night, the king abdicated, leaving the field to nerve and craft. The Axis mocked American carbines as toys, too light, too short-ranged, a poor man's rifle for rear echelon watchers. They counted on routine sentries blinded beyond the wire, officers chained to flares, and tracer-tricks batteries hoarded for radios, not for seeing. Even rumors of electric eyes sounded like science pamphlets, nothing that could stalk a trench at 60 yards under a rain-soaked sky. So the machine of the night ran as it always had. Patrols slipped between listening posts, satchel teams tasted the wire with their hands. Snipers moved forward under a veil that had never betrayed them. The Axis's early successes affirmed the faith. Darkness collapses American advantages, maps motors mass, and shrinks the battlefield down to courage and craft, where they believed they held the edge. They did not anticipate a quiet, workmanlike counter, the kind that does not roar or gleam, but simply works. When it arrived, it did not announce itself with spectacle. It altered a premise. And when a premise moves, every tactic resting on it begins to crack. To Axis eyes, American night fighting looked like a clumsy extension of day tactics into a world that punished clumsiness. The carbine, America's ubiquitous little rifle, was exhibit a light recoil, yes, but light range. Pleasant to carry, but anemic past a stone's throw. On paper, that meant the perimeter could be stalked with impunity so long as you never announced yourself with muzzle flash inside 100 yards. The Axis read the tables and smirked. A weapon born for clerks and radio men could not govern the darkest hours of an infantry war. The rest of the American kit seemed to confirm the prejudice. Illumination flares, predictable brief blinding to both sides, and a brass flare pistol is a bell rung for mortars. Trip flares and rattles, noisy tells that collapse the subtlety of a listening post into a carnival of false alarms. Searchlights, heavy, scarce, and suicidal on a forward line. Even the radios that knitted U.S. firepower together by day turned against them at night. Discipline demanded silence, and silence meant each foxhole became its own lonely kingdom. Weather and ground tipped the scales further. Rain on glass, salt on contacts, mud that swallowed anything with a cable. Coral cuts that taught men to keep their heads down rather than probe. The Axis counted on these small physics to keep the Americans honest and blind. Night was not a contest of factories, it was a contest of patience, and patience, they believed, lived on their side. As rumors bled through of electric eyes, the laughter only grew. If a device needed a battery, it could be starved. If it relied on glass, it would fog. If it had a lamp, the lamp would betray its bearer. Let them bring toys, one staff officer wrote. We will bring rain. In that line was the deeper assumption that American ingenuity made splendid machines for parades, not ugly, tolerant tools for the wire and the ditch. The mockery mistook fragility for limit. It missed the American talent for asking how much performance is enough to break a tactic, and then building exactly that, no more, no less. Under the mockery lay a ledger the Americans could not ignore. On islands and hedgerows alike, the steepest bill came due after sunset. Infiltration teams 2-5, sometimes 10, wormed forward to the wire and made a small, cruel arithmetic cut. 3 strands, throw 2 grenades, finish 1 sentry. If they failed, they melted. If they succeeded, a whole sector woke to sirens and tracers, and a commander guessing whether this was a probe or a preface to something worse. The cost was not merely bodies, it was cohesion. Units slept less, shot more, and trusted their maps less. Fear of what the dark could hide made timid what daylight had made bold. The tools to claw back control were crude. Flares sketched a world for a handful of seconds and then wrecked night vision for minutes. Star shells painted a sky and a silhouette, but also a target marker for enemy tubes. Trip flares lit every rat like a saboteur. Listening posts heard everything and understood nothing. Commanders could shift machine guns, wire, and mortars, but they could not shift the premise the attacker chose the hour and the range. Losses clustered around the same patterns. Cut wire not discovered until dawn, gaps found by the enemy and then reused like smuggler routes. Satchel charges against houses of sandbags that had survived a week of artillery. Friendly fire when a shadow stumbled back through the wrong gap. After every night like that, reports used the same weary euphemisms. Nervous fire, poor illumination, discipline, insufficient early warning phrases that all meant the same thing. We did not see soon enough, and therefore we did not decide soon enough. What the line needed was not a miracle rifle or a new species of bravery. It needed a sense, a way to detect a human approach inside the envelope where night raids lived, without betraying the observer, without summoning the whole battalion with a flare, and without demanding a laboratory's delicacy from a foxhole. The requirement wrote itself: reliable, within 60 to 100 yards, operable by a small team, tolerant of rain, mud, and fear, quiet in signature, quick to train, a device, in other words, that made the perimeter see first. The answer would not be poetic. It would be electrical. And once fielded in enough places, it would turn the knight from a sovereign to a negotiator, one suddenly amenable to American terms. The request did not arrive with trumpets. It came on onion skin, the kind that puckers when you press too hard with a pencil. Provide means to detect hostile movement at night within small arms range without recourse to pyrotechnic illumination. It was 1943, and the paper did not know it was drafting a change in infantry biology. The words moved through offices where light was a problem to be solved, not a condition to be endured, signal corps engineers who thought in wavelengths and amperage, ordnance men who thought in mounts and mass, production officers who thought in crates and ship space. Somewhere a colonel drew a box around 2 phrases: detect movement and without illumination, and wrote a single word in the margin: infrared. If the perimeter is a question, laboratories are answers with solder on them. A bench lamp sits under a red filter. A camera tube stares at a target card inked in charcoal. The first trick is philosophical: stop trying to make the night into day. Instead, send a light that eyes cannot see, then build a tube that can. Engineers isolate a band of the spectrum and teach a lamp to pour it like water. They build a glass and vacuum device that converts the reflection into electrons and then into a picture. It is not a miracle. It is a cascade of tolerances, a bracket that doesn't flex under recoil, a power pack that sulks but performs after an hour in the rain, a cable that doesn't betray itself on coral and doesn't break at the connector when a frightened man flinches. Each small success makes the device less like a patent drawing and more like a tool. Secrecy is the price of magic. The program gets names that sound like nicknames in a barracks Sniperscope for the handheld progenitor Sniperscope when mated to a weapon. The receiver on certain carbines loses iron sights altogether. Men call it a T3 and understand that the missing notch and post are not a defect, but a declaration: this gun lives in a different world. Crates move with paperwork that says electrical equipment. Manuals are written as if they're letters to future mechanics rather than catechisms for believers. Keep the glass clean, keep the cable dry, turn your body to shelter the pack when it rains. The less magic you claim, the more the thing survives contact with mud. In the meeting rooms, the argument at first is familiar: weight, range, battery life. Range produces the most skepticism. A rifleman lives in hundreds of yards. A light carbine is tolerated because it leaves a man less tired at the end of the march. But night raids don't live at 300, they live at 60. An engineer with a tired face draws a cone on a chalkboard and writes a single sentence under it. You only need enough distance to steal back the initiative. Silence holds for a beat, the kind that follows an answer that's both smaller and better than what anyone asked for. Testing moves from polished floors to wet fields. Volunteers learn the device in the only way that matters by missing. They point the lamp where they would point a flashlight and get nothing but glare. They learn to paint with the edge of the cone, not the hot center. They snap the power on and off like nervous men and learn that patience is stealth in electricity too, that constant emission invites chance reflections from raindrops and glossy leaves. They try to shoot like they do at noon and discover parallax. The tube's sightline is not the barrels the bullet arrives below a ghost face unless you've learned the offset and built a new version of muscle memory. The first week's reports are a litany of indignities. The second week's are a litany of fixes. A young sergeant with the hands of a bicycle mechanic proposes a drill that becomes doctrine. The device is not a lone wolf trick, it is a team. One man owns the scope, his world a glowing oval. A second owns the cable and the pack, his job to keep the first man from fighting the cord while he fights the night. A third owns the killing tripod gun, bar or rifle fire on call. The watcher does not rush to shoot, he rushes to call, range and bearing in plain infantry words, not laboratory ones. 70 right of stump, 2 crawling. The gun team answers the math with metal. The scope man watches for the second wave that used to slip past, while the first wave taught the defenders to stare the wrong way. Security men worry about the lamp. If the enemy can see the beam, the trick dies. The mathematicians and the medical officers sit together for once and agree human retinae do not register this band. The only ways to detect it are machines like ours or animal accident. That is not invulnerability. It is merely a budget for risk. Keep the beam contained to the ground. Avoid mirrors in the landscape. Do not sweep sky. Operators learn the new taboos as surely as they learn to keep a finger off a trigger until a shot is real. A quartermaster somewhere tries to temper the program with common sense and almost ruins it. Issue 1 per battalion. They are delicate. The test officers reply with a sentence that saves lives. Issue enough to make a habit. A habit is stronger than a gadget. With 1 device per sector, the device is a curiosity. With 3, it becomes a pattern. With 5, it becomes a language. Who carries, who scans, who covers, who sleeps because he trusts the scan. The line stops improvising and starts scheduling. Batteries are checked at 1800 like rifles, and men can tell by sound if a pack is lying about its charge. The oddest moral victory is internal. Infantrymen are not sentimental about equipment, they are conservative about risk. They accept what keeps them alive and resent what wastes strength. In the second month, men stop asking whether the scope works and start arguing over who gets to carry it. Ownership is the surest sign a tool has crossed from novelty into muscle. There are the usual crises: a lamp floods on a wet night. Someone cuts a poncho into a shroud and ties it with bootlace. A mount loosens. A file from an ammo can lid makes a shim. A pack hums too loudly on a quiet ridge. Men learn to press it against their chest with a hand and feel the vibration damp. A lieutenant tries to turn the thing into a toy of precision, find me the sniper at 200, and the platoon quietly corrects him, "Sir, this is for the wire and the draw." When the order finally cuts that sets of scope pack and prepared carbines will move with assault divisions, it reads like logistics. It does not say, "We are giving the dark back to our side." It says, "Ship, stage, train, replace tubes as needed." The men who wrote it knew that the fastest way to kill an idea is to make it romantic. They packaged it instead as a job: learn this, teach the next squad, then fight. If there is genius in this story, it is not the glamour kind, and that is the point. A glamour invention begs to be copied. A workman's invention begs to be used. The device did not promise superhuman vision, it offered enough sight at the exact distance where the enemy's advantage had lived. That calibration of aspiration to effect was the secret courage in the program. When it made sure, it did so in wooden boxes, not parades. When it took the line, it did so in whispers between men who would stand the watch. And when it worked, the enemy did not know a new instrument was present. They only knew an old habit had stopped paying. The last act of development took place where development always ends in the hands of people who could not afford the luxury of admiration. In their mouths, the device lost its long name. It became the scope or the lantern that doesn't. They did not recite the specifications. They told each other stories in which a man rose from a shadow, and for the first time in a year of war, someone saw him before he was at the wire. In engineering, that is called validation. In infantry language, it is called a night that passed without a letter home, beginning, "We regret to inform you." Start with a cone of light no eye can see. Not a beam like a searchlight that carves the dark, but a flood in a narrow band of the spectrum beyond red. Fit a lamp to throw that flood and a filter to sift its color so tightly that even a cat's eye ignores it. Bathe the ground with that invisible wash and wait for it to bounce. Everything reflects wire bark cloth skin, but not equally. Then give a glass tube the gift of noticing a surface that liberates electrons when that invisible light touches it. An electric field that gathers those electrons into an image that blooms on a screen coated so a human eye can read it. That is the whole theology of active infrared, send, receive, reveal. The tube is the heart and the heartbreak. It is a fragile thing doing a brutal job. The front end, call it the eye, must be guarded against rain salt and fingers. The middle, call it the throat, must keep its vacuum and its temper when the weapon kicks. The back, call it the mouth, must present a picture a frightened man can pass at once. The image it draws is not a painting. It is a ghost mask, brighter where the invisible light returns, darker where it is swallowed. Edges are everything. A crawling man at 50 yards is not a man. He is a set of angles moving together with a rhythm grass can't quite imitate. Power turns frailty into function. The pack on the operator's back is not a battery in the flashlight sense. It is a source of discipline. Voltage must arrive as promised, or the image stutters into grain and lies. The cable is an umbilical and a liability, so the drill grows around it. The second man carries coil, and slack becomes a shadow that mirrors the operator's steps. Learns to anticipate so the cord never snags when the device must swing fast to catch something moving low. Alignment is a new kind of marksmanship. The scope does not look down the barrel, it looks beside it. The bullet obeys Newton, the image obeys Maxwell, and the operator must marry them. Unit 0 at night, not noon. They choose a stake at 60 or 80 yards, soak it in the invisible flood, and build a new confidence hold. Here for a chest hold lower, for a crouch brace. Your breath for a wobble the glass will amplify when the shooting is delegated to a crew-served weapon, and often it is the watcher becomes a conductor, not a soloist. 2 moving low left of washout 55. The gun's tracer is the only language the enemy hears. The device seems like a lamp, but its doctrine is closer to fishing than to lighting. You do not thrash the water, you cast and wait. Constant emission is a beginner's sin. It turns rain into glitter and leaves into quilts of bright and dim that hide the thing you are hunting. Operators learn to pulse the flood, to sweep just wide of the expected approach, and then cut across it. They learn their ground by night, as surveyors learn theirs by day, the stump that blooms too bright because its bark gleams when wet. The gully that eats light, the section of wire that glares like a river when dew is thick. They learn to love the edge of the cone where contrast is kinder and silhouettes announce themselves. Rain is the enemy and the teacher. It lays a skin on everything and returns the flood with a shimmer that lies without meaning. The field fix is simple and profound. Turn the device into a painter's brush. Lower the lamp, narrow the sweep, use the cone's shoulder to rake across the likely crawl. The other answer is tactical. Don't fight physics alone. Position the scope so that likely approaches are against ground that doesn't betray you scrub, instead of bare coral earth, instead of sheeted rock. The device doesn't need perfect conditions, it needs conditions that are enough. Why can't the enemy simply know they are being painted? Because humans are not built for this light. There is no reflex to it. There is no sting in the eye. Only a machine can be offended by the flood, and machines of that kind are inventions too, with their own supply chains and training burdens. To counter an active IR device with your own detector, you must field not one clever prototype, but many unromantic sets, packs, tubes, mounts, and teach your infantry to use them in the exact places where their doctrine says stealth should carry the day. Late in a losing war, that is a bridge too far. What of the lamp giving itself away? In theory, a bright emitter leaks a sliver of visible light at close angles or from the bulb's hardware. In practice, the lamp sits behind a filter and a shroud, and the operator lives by taboos that deny the enemy the only angles that would help. The beam's geometry is a blessing. It travels the ground, not the sky. Unless an infiltrator stares directly into the device within a few yards, an irony that ends the stare, there is nothing to see. Animals sometimes react. Men do not. The silence of the trick is its protection. The strongest part of the source is not the tube, though, and not the lamp. It is the calibration of enough. The system does not attempt long night sniping. It does not pretend to own 200 yards of dark. It owns the 50 to 100 yards that define the difference between a raid that detonates at the wire and a raid that dies before it can rise. That narrow ambition enables everything else to be rugged instead of delicate. A smaller lamp because you're not asking for a distant hill. A pack you can carry because you don't need to run it all night, only when the enemy's habits say he will come. A training cycle you can finish in days because the art is not in physics lectures, but in learning the ground and the team choreography. There is also a psychological economy at work. When a sentry believes he can see, he listens better. He uses his ears to cue his lamp rather than to fuel his fear. He shoots less and calls more. He wastes fewer rounds into a hedge that only sounded alive. This doesn't appear on specification sheets, but it is where the system earns interest on its weight. A quiet line is a rested line. A rested line is a line that doesn't break at 4 in the morning. Could an enemy with similar technology counter? In principle, yes. In practice, the timing is merciless. To field an answer, you must do 3 things at once: manufacture the sets in quantity, write tactics that place them exactly where night work happens, and convince men who trust the night like an old friend that the friendship has turned. When your army is retreating by day and raiding by night to compensate, admitting the night has been compromised is a doctrinal humiliation. The result is hesitation. Hesitation in the dark is measurable in yards and minutes, and those are the units in which raids fail. Last, the system cooperates with other American strengths. The scope is not a lonely sense. It is a scout for machine guns, mortars, and radios that are suddenly smarter after midnight. It turns firepower from a bludgeon into a set of surgical taps. A watcher catches the lead elements. A gun chews the gap they must pass. A flare, when finally fired, is punctuation rather than the whole sentence. The night's grammar changes from alarm, chaos to detection, control, brief violence, quiet. That sequence is felt by the enemy as a seizure, one moment of freedom, turning into 3 decisions made for them by strangers they cannot see. In the end, the secret is not supernatural. It is a lamp, a tube, a pack, a mount, and a drill that teaches men to treat the night like a map, not a myth. The Axis could not detect it in time because there was nothing to feel or hear, only the effects. They could not react in time because reaction requires comprehension, and comprehension requires a premise they did not possess, that the night was no longer theirs. By the time that premise flickered into view, the patrols that had depended on it were already dissolving, caught not by a spotlight, but by a kind of attention that does not announce itself, only arrives. April 1945, the ridges west of Shuri, Okinawa. Rain had settled into the coral like a second skin, and the night smelled of batteries and wet rope. The perimeter of an army regiment lay in a broken horseshoe around a patch of dead ground that every map called safe and every veteran distrusted. Through the day, engineers had stapled the earth with pickets and wire. Through dusk, the outposts had gone quiet and thin. Then at 2100, a squad leader tapped the shoulder of a private who wore a carbine with a humped silhouette and a cable that vanished into a pack on another man's spine. They took their place like stagehands, no speeches. The watcher slid in beside a half-buried stump. The cable man nested behind him, fingers already paying slack the way a pianist pays the left hand to the right. 30 yards back, a machine gun crew hunched under a poncho rigged as a roof against the gleam of sky. Their barrel pointed into what the operations map called Approach B, a shallow swale that wandered down toward the wire, and if you believed both patrol reports and ghosts, carried men the way a drain carries rain. At 21:35, the pack hummed. Not loud, more a cat's purr against the ribs of the cable man. The watcher tilted the lamp just low enough to paint the swale and not the air. Nothing happens at once in the night. The dark must be persuaded to confess. The oval in the scope thickened, thinned, became a geography of reflected invisibles, a glossier rock here, a thirsty piece of coral there, wire that gleamed like a sketch of lightning if you caught it at the right angle. Training said, wait. He waited 5 seconds 10, pulsing the flood once, twice in slow measures. They had rehearsed a lexicon for what came next because terror needs grammar. At 21:41, the watcher whispered, single, low crawl, 75, left of washout. No one moved, not even the wind. The machine gun crew tightened their world to 2 rules: no fire until called, no light ever. The crawling shape paused, rose to a crouch in the wash of the invisible cone, and became unmistakably a man, head, shoulders, a bag strapped tight to keep it from knocking wire. The watcher did not shoot. He slid the cone a finger's width right and found a second shimmer, another man on his belly slower behind. He drew a line in words too. Staggered. Now both crouched. The sergeant on the gun held his fire through the first old reflex there, shoot there, and waited for the second signal. The one the new tool demanded a bearing that would place the burst not where the men were, but where they would flinch. On. The word is a cork, popping quiet final. The gun exhaled 6 rounds like someone tearing cloth. Green ghosts in a glass world folded, scrambled, then fell into angles they could not hide. The second team riflemen with fields laid on that lane fired 2 deliberate shots that were half sound, half measure. A third shape, third spooled into being, only because the watcher stayed with the edge of the cone where contrast is kind. Third, right of stump, fast. The bar cut a saw through canvas. Silence returned not as peace, but as an emptiness you could measure with your pulse. At 22:06, a mortar tried to answer. It fell long, then another and another walking left, punishing a hedgerow where the Americans were not. Because the old arithmetic still ruled the enemy's minds, we were seen by flare, therefore their eyes are high. The watcher let the lamp sleep for a minute, rain was thickening, and listened to fragments of speech in a tongue he didn't know. When he pressed the switch again, the swale bloomed differently. Men were testing not the wire now, but the theory of the wire rolling stones and sticks to fake motion and sound. Physics was on the watcher's side. Sticks make stick angles. Men make human angles even when they try not to. He caught a quarter of a shoulder and held it the way a fisherman holds tension before a strike. 2 more, low, 50. The gun sergeant breathed and placed a 4-round tap exactly where a man forced by fear to rise would rise. The scope confirmed one shape half lifted, then slackened, then tried to crawl through, being still. This was not a duel, it was choreography. A listening post on the left called faint movement rats or men. The watcher panned without lifting the invisible beam into sky. A wet rock flared too bright. He cut power, shifted, pulsed again, and found that the wetness had lied. A minute later he slid back to the swale just in time to catch a small procession, no more than 3, making the same mistake as the first. He counted breath, not figures, because breath kept his hands from shaking and the lamp from painting a glitter of rain that would steal the picture. He felt the cableman's knuckles against his calf, a simple ready that meant the slack was paid a turn, could happen without a snag. He was not alone in the problem the lamp invented. The pattern repeated across the sector. In another company's lane, a scope team caught a patrol pooling at a dogleg in the wire. They didn't shoot, they talked. 6. Kneeling. The captain in the CP had been waiting hours to use a string of letters that meant drop a single round on a coordinate and make them think the Earth disapproves. The mortar coughed once. The dogleg bucked. The 6 melted in every direction but forward. In a third lane, a scope team watched a man on a runner's crouch shadow a trench line. He was brave in the wrong language and paid the bill in the correct one. By midnight, the enemy changed tactics, proof of confusion. Instead of pairs, they came in singles. Instead of a quiet test, they tried a quick rush by 2 men with their bodies low and their courage set to reckless. The watcher did not lead them with bullets, he led them with information. Right lane, 2. Fast, 35. The call traveled through 3 men like a current. The gun chewed a short doorway into the dark. One figure slammed flat. The second tried to veer into a gully that had hidden men all month. The scope saw him as a brighter smear against Earth that swallowed less. The rifleman, who was supposed to be sleeping, rose to one knee and fired a shot. His father's hunting rifle had taught him the cross of old skill and new seeing. The rush died not with a shout, but with the small decisive noises men make when decisions are made for them. Dawn infantry reads like a story you dare not tell too loudly, for fear it will stop being true. Wire uncut. Satchel charges abandoned with their fuses still wrapped in wax paper. Footprints where a squad had tried to find a gap and found equations instead. The machine gun crew counted their belts and discovered they had extra, a wartime miracle. We fired less, a corporal said, and I knew why every time. On the third night, the enemy tried something new. Shoot the lights you cannot see. They sprayed the perimeter in flat arcs at random, hoping to hit the lamp or the man who held it. The watchers had been taught the third taboo, never put your head where your picture lives. They kept the tube offset and their eyes behind cover, painting the approach with the shoulder of the cone. Tracers laced overhead. The invisible flood stayed low, a river with no sound. A single bullet found the cable once and sheared it near the connector. The second man already had tape in his teeth. 30 seconds later, the picture returned and the swale resumed being a chalkboard on which human figures wrote their mistakes. What made it a trial by fire was not only the incoming, It was the inward trial of nerves, the temptation to sweep too wide, to leave the lamp on, to chase ghosts of rain. The teams disciplined themselves into a tempo pulse pause call, pulse confirm call. In doing so, they taught the rest of the line a new rhythm. The flare pistols were still there, but they became punctuation. The mortars were still there, but they became scalpels. The patrols that went out at 0300 to drag the dead in for intelligence went out with knowledge of where to step. And perhaps most important though, it doesn't print well on a situation report the men slept more. Fear receded like tide from a reef and left a bit of dry sand for the living to stand on. By week's end, the battalion journal logged the nights as quiet to moderate. That was the official dialect for a phenomenon the enlisted men phrased better. They stopped coming, like they knew the map. Doc, the medic, no one called by his given name, told the chaplain that his busiest hour had moved from 0400 to not at all. The colonel, who had not wanted gadgets on his line, said nothing grand. He walked the perimeter at dusk and asked the supply sergeant how many spare tubes sat in the tent and whether the new crates had the good mounts, not the ones that loosened when a man breathed wrong. That is how acceptance sounds in a war that doesn't pay for speeches. In the enemy's dugouts, explanations multiplied like mold. Some said the Americans had trained dogs to hear wire cutters at 100 yards. Some said new microphones had been buried under the soil. A few muttered about electric eyes and were told to keep such talk for later for after victory. But victory did not grow closer. The men who had been proud of their nightcraft were now being measured and found. The god that had lived in darkness had not died, it had changed priests. The place has a name, Okinawa, and the date has numbers April to June, but the lesson is not a postal address. It is a method put an instrument exactly on the seam where the enemy believes the world protects him, then let discipline make it larger than its parts. The scope did not conquer the island, it conquered a habit. The first effect was confusion. The second, more valuable effect was predictability for the Americans. The third was fatigue for the enemy. The trial, in other words, burned away the doubts around a simple sentence that the line came to trust: if we look, we will see in time. Realization never arrives as a speech. It arrives as a subtraction. Patrols that used to return with wire fragments and stories now return with silence and excuses. On the fourth night after the first failed approaches, a Japanese corporal briefed his men with the old confidence crawl, freeze, rise, cut, and led them toward a gully he had used twice in March. He lay listening at 30 yards and heard nothing but the slow teeth of a distant gun chewing a belt. When he rose, his knees brushed wet grass. In the same instant, two things happened that did not fit his world. A burst found the exact angle his body had to trace to pass the wire, and another burst found the man behind him who hadn't yet moved. It felt in his words, written later, like someone had traced the shape of our intentions. Fear changes men's geometry. The next team approached in a stretched file, refusing the old cluster that let a single grenade ruin a night. They paused every third body length and scanned the sky for a flare that never came. The absence of light was wrong. The ambush came anyway. Shots that were not sprayed but placed. The corporal told his lieutenant at dawn, "They do not see us when we rise. They know where we will be if we rise. That is not poetry, that is diagnosis." Rumor, the oldest staff officer, worked the trenches. The Americans have cat's eyes. They have taught their glass to drink darkness. They shine a light that is not a light. The company commander, embarrassed by metaphors, tried to force the war back into rules. He ordered a probe with grenades thrown high to draw fire and give away positions. The night replied with contempt. The first grenade arced, the line did not flare. The second arced, still no flare. Men were shot in the space between their own flashes, the very seam they had always trusted. That seam had been purchased by someone else. At battalion, the staff made shapes on acetate overlays, new paths that might be less watched, deeper, dead ground that might still be blind. But maps failed where psychology failed. Men who had once flowed like water now moved like men, trying not to be seen by a god that counts. They hurried when they should have frozen, froze when they should have passed, and filled the night with the grammar of indecision, half steps, shallow breaths, rifles held too high. The Americans did not need to see everything. They needed only to see enough to make those mistakes fatal. In a cave used as a command post, an intelligence officer sorted through captured leaflets and cigarette tins and came across a photograph torn from a magazine, an American soldier smiling over a carbine swollen by a lamp and a tube. It looked like a farm boy with a science project. He laughed and then stopped laughing when the company runner, who had spent too many nights south of the wire, stared and said, voice thin, "They have that." A nervous joke turned into a policy, and the policy turned into a strain. You could not hide, raids were cut down, then postponed, then ordered only under rain, loud enough to hide a battalion. But rain lies to the tool less than it lies to men who want it to be an ally. Panic, when it comes to professional soldiers, rarely takes the form of running. It takes the form of rules rewritten on the fly. Do not cut wire at the low point. Cut where the slope breaks and American cones might be misangled. Do not crawl, crab sideways. Do not carry the bag of charges on your back. Drag it. Do not go in twos. Go alone. These counters each made a kind of sense. They also multiplied the chance of error and lengthened the time a man had to spend under the new gaze. The more time, the more pulses of an invisible lamp. The more pulses, the more chances for a silhouette to betray the geometry of a human decision. There is a specific flavor to the moment professionals concede the premise of a battlefield has shifted. It often arrives couched in logistics. A regimental log note ordered the hoarding of black cloth to wrap wire cutters, the scraping of shine from canteens, the confiscation of helmets too glossy. Shine had never mattered this much. Now men moved through the dark as if their own skin might betray them. They switched to routes with more scrub, less coral. They began to fear the bare earth. In the same entry, a line that carried more heartbreak than any enemy bullet. Reduce night action to essential reconnaissance until counter-devised. When a doctrine announces it will hibernate, it is admitting winter has arrived. Across an ocean in defeated Germany, other men were making a parallel, quieter admission. Engineers who had strapped a box called ZG-1229 to a rifle and dreamt of night raids that would turn the front porous. Now read captured reports and realize someone else had lived their dream, first only differently. Where their vision had been to equip assault groups and push darkness outward, the Americans had taken the more humble, more lethal path, equip watchmen, and pull darkness inward until it could be managed. A panther's cat's eye was a promise that never reached maturity. A carbine with a pack was a nuisance that became a law. How does realization feel to the man at the wire, like a voice you cannot hear asking a question you cannot ignore? If I move, am I already measured? A Japanese sergeant who had made a reputation for crawling through dead ground began to make mistakes. A recruit would have scorned rising too high, rushing the last few yards, flinging his wire cutters away when a burst tore the air within arm's reach. He later told a fellow NCO, "They did not wait for our noise. They waited for our shape." Shape is a word for both geometry and fate. The climax of comprehension often looks operational from above and intimate from within. On a night meant for a company-sized raid, a daring thing in the dying weeks of a futile defense, the commanders ordered a feint on the left and the main effort through a notch scouted at dusk. The feint, measured by the Americans' new sense, was slain early and without fuss. The main effort reached the notch in good order and then seemed to hit an invisible wall. Fire did not pour, it selected. The first 3 men fell as if the ground had choices. The 4th broke right into an angle the watchers had already mapped. The 5th went prone and stayed there, unable to make his courage agree with his training. The raiders did not rout, they simply stopped being able to act as a group. That is what an invisible system does when it is tuned to a tactic. It dissolves coordination. Without coordination, bravery is individual and brief. At dawn, the field told the truth that reports soften. Charges intact on straps. Wire nicked but not parted. A path of pressed grass that ended in a fan of blood, then dried into nothing because the survivors had crawled backward for a long time. The Americans policed the ground and found among the ordinary one extraordinary thing, a set of wire cutters wrapped not with cloth but with blackened paper lacquered against shine, a desperate craft solution to a physics problem men had not fully named. The captain held them a long moment and then handed them to the scope team's sergeant, an undeserved tribute paid by one trade to another. What happened in the enemy's minds after that is not a secret. Diaries and post-war statements say it without flourish. The night stopped giving. The language dulled, raids reduced, postponed, cancelled. Patrols became reconnaissance, and reconnaissance became rumor. A lieutenant who had once lectured that Americans would always choose noise over patience now told his platoon that the Americans had learned patience that could see. He did not use the words infrared or image tube or emitter. He used the only word that fit inside a soldier's chest: eyes. The shock finally was not that an invisible thing killed men. Soldiers accept invisible things all the time, Mines, gas in other wars, artillery with no visible gun. The shock was agency, the sensation that someone far calmer, far less hurried, was looking exactly where you would be next. No prayer counters that, only a counter-instrument would, and counter-instruments require factories and training cycles and time. Night does not grant time to the side that has already lost the day. So the realization crested not as panic, but as a thinning. Night action thinned, options thinned, faith thinned. The Americans did not shout victory over this. They used the quiet to sleep, to mend, to save ammunition, to plan without flinching. In a war whose gods had been mass and steel in daylight, one of the last decisive turns came from glass and discipline in darkness. The men who had believed the night was theirs learned without ceremony that it had been leased to someone else, paid for in PAX tubes, and a drill that made the strange familiar. And once a lease is signed by performance, it is very hard to break by wish. Weapons change battles, senses change doctrines. Once active IR watch teams proved they could see first, inside the 50-pound 100-yard envelope, the geometry of night warfare tilted. What had been the Axis's cheapest force multiplier, darkness, stopped paying. Raids shrank, then slowed, then were risked only under rain and moonless wind. That single tactical deflation cascaded upward. At the company level, the night grammar shifted from alarm, chaos to detection, control, brief violence, quiet. Ammunition discipline improved. False flares dropped. Machine gun belts lasted longer because guns fired with information instead of at fear. Platoons slept, really slept for the first time in weeks, which meant cleaner dawn actions and steadier patrols. Rest is a logistics of the mind, and it compounds. At battalion and regiment, the perimeter hardened without adding bodies. Commanders moved mortars and wire according to what the scope saw, not what they guessed. That shrank the enemy's options and lengthened his timelines, deadly in defense, priceless in offense. The Americans did not need to own the entire night. They needed to own the decision points within it. Active IR gave them those points on demand. Strategically, the lesson outran the island. Doctrine writers captured it in dry prose: night security by instrument, not by pyrotechnic chance, and procurement followed: more sets, better tubes, refined mounts, training syllabi. The Axis had invested identity and morale in nightcraft. Suddenly, that craft was obsolete unless matched by equal instrumentation and a new humility about stealth. In late war, neither was available at scale. Thus, an unglamorous device achieved a glamorous effect. It rendered an enemy strategy attack at night to erase American advantages out of date. When your premise expires, your plans follow. The war machine rolled, not because a miracle arrived, but because a modest technology aligned with American strengths organization supply drill and turned darkness from an ally of the attacker into a managed space of the defender. Post-war interviews are full of reluctant clarity. Axis officers who had trusted the night as doctrine found themselves explaining failure in the plainest terms: not courage, not will, vision. One Japanese company commander, debriefed in 1946, put it without poetry: "We trained to be unseen, they trained to see." A German technical officer comparing late-war IR experiments to what he learned of American sets wrote, "We had the idea, not the numbers or the habit." Albert Speer's broader admission about American capacity hovers over all of it. The recognition that the United States won not only with steel and fuel, but with the industrialization of useful ideas. Active IR was exactly that, not a wonder weapon, a working weapon. It did not need to dazzle. It needed to make raids predictable and therefore mortal. The most telling line comes from an anonymous infantry debrief, translated in 1946, a sentence that could be stamped on the doctrine manual that followed. At night, they were already looking where we would be next. There is no countercharge to that, no slogan to defeat it. Only equal instruments and new tactics could have answered, and by the time such answers could be made, the war that required them was already ending.